friends. This is Hailey Whispering Rose, and this evening I would like to give you lesson 2 on music theory. Lesson 1 has already been published. However, you can either choose to watch it again, and I will put a link in the description of this video, or you can watch this one first. They're both kind of twin videos that can go hand in hand. And you can watch one and then the other. It does not really matter the order because they don't have much to do with each other just yet. So, in this lesson, I will be teaching you about the brother to melody, which would be rhythm. Now, there are several things to keep in mind about rhythm when you are thinking about music. As I said, there is only one type of instrument that works only with rhythm, and that would be percussion. Percussion is the only instrument that uses just the rhythm factor. All other instruments, including the voice, must use both rhythm and melody in order to produce music. What is rhythm exactly? Rhythm, the best way I can think to describe rhythm would be the amount of time that it takes to go from one note, one beat, to another. It's the time that it takes from one beat to another. For example, the only way that you can jump in intervals, which I explain in my other basic music theory lesson, is by singing or playing one note for a certain period of time and then moving to the next note. So you have to have a defined amount of time for each of those notes, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, you're never going to go forward. So, today we're going to learn about the different aspects of rhythm. In terms of musical composition. So, one aspect of rhythm is beats. Beats are described as the amount of time each note in a musical composition gets. And some examples would be, and I'll explain all of these in a moment. Some examples would be quarter notes, half notes, whole notes, and second notes. So those are examples, and I'll explain, like I said, a little more about what they are in detail in a moment. So that would be one aspect of it. Another aspect of rhythm is time signature. And time signature, for those of you who may have actually seen music theory, or excuse me, a actual musical composition would be best described as those numbers that are at the very beginning next to the treble clef or the bass clef. They can be examples such as 4/4, 3/4, 6/8, etc. So, and with a time signature, we can take 4/4 as an example. All that means is it's basically the, let's say you're working with 4/4. You're looking at the amount of beats in the measure. That's another good term, I'll tell you in a moment. Amount of beats in the measure, and which, on the bottom, it would be which kind of note gets one beat. So if you count equals 1 right there. So what this means, and another good definition of this would, another good definition for rhythm would be measure. Measure. Now measure is basically the little brackets that you see in music. So if you have your little staff here, let's just draw a treble clef. And again, if you don't know what a treble clef is, you can check my other music theory lesson. And you've got your little staff here. I'll draw the lines a little bit longer. So you'll have your time signature here, let's say 4/4, okay? And then you'll have your measure. Your measure may allow for beat 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now that you have 4 beats, because it's 4 beats that are allowed, you have to start a new measure, because you're not allowed any more beats in that measure, and that's kind of the way that it's organized. Rhythm is all about organization of music, how you keep it all together. So then here you'd be allowed another 4 beats. You'd be allowed 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you have to break the measure off again. So this here and this here are both measures. They're both measures. Now, you've got your beats, you've got your time signature, and you have your measures. With these 3 aspects, you can go ahead and organize all of the music in the Western world. You just need to learn about the different kinds of ways that you can organize it. But if you have all of these things in your head, then you know where it is that you're going. So, now that we have all of these together, I'm going to go ahead and erase these right in there. Perfect. For these things, I'm going to once again use the treble clef, and I will give a little more information on the bass clef in another lesson. If you're still wondering, again, what treble and bass clef are, you're going to want to check out my other lesson. So, we'll go ahead and draw our staff. And we will not be worrying too much about where the notes are going on the staff for the purpose of teaching rhythm, because it's more about how many beats are in the staff in this instance. So I'm going to be placing them in the same spot and drawing them as an X, and that's just an indication that it is a note. It could be any note, but I'm going to put it just somewhere that's easy for you to see visually. So we'll go ahead and draw our staff here. Line 1. And again, I apologize for the lines not being perfect. I do not have a ruler with me. And this sort of thing is usually taught on a special board that already has staff lines written or taped on it permanently. Okay, so here we have our 5 lines and 4 spaces. Again, if you're unfamiliar, you can check my other video, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to start out with the most common time signature used in, I'd say, about 90%, 95% of all modern music. And when I say modern, I mean things within the last 20 years or so, pop music, top 40 type music, things you would be familiar with as a non-musical major in any lessons. And that time signature is 4/4, which I'll write in a different color here. I'll write it in red. It's 4/4. Yeah. So there we have that. And 4/4 again means that there are 4 beats per measure. And it means that a quarter note, because if you can imagine this being written as 1/4, whatever's at the bottom, just like a regular fraction, means that the quarter note gets a beat. 1 beat. Now, oftentimes people will say that music and math are interlinked, and it's very true in a lot of different ways, a lot of very complicated musically and complicated mathematically ways. Complicated ways musically and mathematically. However, here it is actually interlinked in a very basic way. So I apologize if math is not your forte or not something that you enjoy watching. However, it is a little bit necessary when you're dealing with music. Not much beyond counting and basic fraction work, though, so just bear with me. Like I said, the quarter note gets the beat, so if you imagine 4/4 in terms of money, in American money, you have a quarter, which is a quarter of a dollar. A dollar is 100 cents, a quarter is 25 cents. If you imagine 4 of those, it makes up the whole measure. The same thing is true here. If you have a quarter note looks like this, all the way filled in with a little flagpole, just like that. Now, I'll put this as that is a quarter note. So, for these intents and purposes, I'm just going to put an X through it. Or I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that, actually, to avoid confusion. In this case, let's say I have two measures here. Yes, so here's my measure 1, and here's my measure 2. Let's say I have all quarter notes. They will look like this. And we'll just add a little tail there. Just like that. They'll all look like that. Why? Because 4 beats per measure. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. And the quarter beat counts as 1 beat. So you'll say 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's very basic like that. And when you clap it, it just goes 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good? Good. Okay, so we'll get a little bit more complex here. Let's bring out my little eraser here. Just carefully erase each of these little guys here. Perfect. Okay. Okay. We'll just go ahead and redraw these lines a little bit because they're kind of messed up. After I took all that time to erase it. Okay. Now, the next note breakup we should start with would be whole notes. Whole notes are pretty much exactly as they sound, which I'll go ahead and write up here. So this up here is a whole note. It looks like a little donut or a ring, and it's whole in the sense that it takes up the whole measure. Now, obviously, if it takes up the whole measure, there is no room for any other notes at any other time. So whenever you see a whole note in a measure, you will always only see that one note. And it just looks like this. So typically it's more in the center, so I'll just go ahead and draw it more in the center. And that's all it looks like. And it is counted as 1. And 1. And when I say it like that, it's because you don't clap it as 1, 1. If your rhythm is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, then you will simply say the note as 1. 1, 1, 1. And it is held for the entire measure. So whole notes are pretty simple, and I think that you're all very smart, so we'll keep going. I'm going to erase this little guy here. And this little guy right here. Good. Now, the next note, which I'm going to be putting right in here, is going to be, you can take a guess. If there's a quarter note and a whole note, in between them must be a half note. And the reason I was very specific about filling in this quarter note is because a half note looks very, very similar, except it looks like this, with an empty space in the middle. Now, this would be a half note. There we go. Now, a half note gets, as you would guess, half the measure. And in the case where there is 4 beats per measure, half of 4 is 2. So you get 2 beats per half note. Therefore, you can only put 2 half notes in a 4 beat measure. So it will look like this. There we go, just like that. There's one and another. By the way, these tails could be these little flags here. They can be facing up or down. It just depends on where on the staff they are, but they still get the same amount of time. So if you were to, for example, see a note, a half note up here, with its tail pointing down, it still gets the same amount of time. It's just for a purpose, really for aesthetically pleasing purposes. It looks better to have the tail pointing down this way as opposed to up this way. However, in no way does that affect the music at all. So we're just gonna erase this little guy here because he does not belong here. There we go. Hi, could you close the door, please? So we'll just go ahead and erase this little guy here because it does not belong. And continue with this. So the half note gets, like I said, 2 beats per measure and is counted thusly. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you are counting this in 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you would hear it like this. 1, 3, 1, and so on. Now, for the half note, you can only have 2 of them, and there's 2 more notes I'm going to teach you because they are the most commonly used ones. There are more rhythmic options, obviously, just as you can keep cutting a pie smaller and smaller and smaller, you can keep cutting notes smaller and smaller and smaller. However, it'll get a little confusing to count them out for you today. So I'm going to stick to the most basic ones that you're going to see should you decide to read music. Now, just gonna erase this little guy here, and thank you for bearing with me with all the erasing. Just gotta make sure that we have a nice clean slate to work with so no one gets confused. Okay, so the next note, if you have a whole note and a half note and a quarter note, the next note to pay attention to would be an 8th note. Now the 8th note is a little bit funnier looking. It looks just like this, with a little flag hanging off of it. So that would be 8th note. Now the 8th note, obviously, if it's half of a quarter note, that means that you can fit 8 of them into the measure. Now, don't be confused. Don't think that because this is called an 8th note that you can always fit 8 of them into a measure. That's not the case. It just so happens that 1/8, as we discussed, is half of 1/4, which means you can put twice as many of these notes as you can these notes, regardless of what kind of key signature you have. Now, for the 8th note, I was going to write it out. For the 8th note, since you could put 4 quarter notes, you can put 8 8th notes. So we're just going to put down right here, because they're a little tiny. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now, before I draw the tails on them, I want to explain a little bit about how they're different than the other 3 that you've learned about so far. With the 8th notes, you can draw them several ways. If you have a single 8th note, you can just give it a little tail, like that. Excuse me. Like that. And there is absolutely nothing incorrect about continuing on with each of these and just giving them tails. However, with 8th notes, your other options are to also connect them in a very popular way. You may have seen music symbols written, which is to put what is known as a bar on them. So this would be a bar. And there is also nothing incorrect about putting a bar on each of these. Now, the last way that you can actually write them, if and only if there is 4 of these eighth notes together, and no more and no less, is if there's 4, exactly 4, you can join all 4 of them together. Not 5, not 3, not any other, because that's a whole different, that means something completely different. Kind of like where you decide to put an apostrophe in a word or in a sentence can completely change the meaning of what you're trying to say. And in that way, music theory is a bit of a language that it takes a bit of practice to learn. So, both of these are bars. Both of these are correct. These are flags. These are also correct. And you can call them flags, tails. Basically, whatever they look like to you is a fine thing to call them. You typically hear them as flags or tails, though. Now, oh, I almost forgot how to count these. Now, with these, because the quarter note was 1, 2, 3, 4, you can't add more numbers into the measure. So you're not going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're not going to do that because, again, you're only allowed 4 beats per measure. That's it. So you may be wondering, how do I break this down? Well, you have to take 1 half point, 2 half point, 3 half point, etc. And the way that you would count that would be 1 and is the proper way to say it when you're counting out your rhythms. So you have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and this is just a little ampersand for anybody who's wondering. So, and then when you get to here, you start over. You say 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So when you're counting these out, they have to start. You have to keep the rhythm. You have to keep the everything going. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4. With your eighth notes, you'll have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and don't forget the extra and after 4, because I did that a lot when I was studying music theory, and it cost me a lot of grades. Okay, so we've got the eighth note. There's one last note, actual type of note I would like to teach you, and then we'll get just a little bit fancy, and then we'll call it a day for today, because that's quite a bit of information, and I realize that. A lot of people like to make these types of lessons take weeks or months or even, a whole semester worth of time, but they really don't need to. As long as everybody stays nice and focused, you can actually cover quite a bit of ground as far as basic music theory goes in one single lesson. Okay.